The smell of eggs and bacon filled the cramped mess hall as Maria Santos wiped sweat from her forehead. She had been cooking for the SEAL team for 8 months now, and the routine had become second nature. Wake up at 400, prep breakfast, serve the team, clean up, repeat. It wasn't glamorous work, but someone had to feed the warriors. Maria never planned to be here in this remote outpost in Afghanistan. Back home in Texas, she had been a chef at a fancy restaurant in San Antonio. Good money, regular hours, and no bullets flying overhead. But when her younger brother Diego was killed in action, something inside her changed. She couldn't just stay home and pretend the war wasn't happening. She needed to do something, anything, to help the soldiers fighting overseas. The recruitment officer had looked surprised when she walked into his office. A 28-year-old woman wanting to deploy to a combat zone as kitchen staff wasn't exactly common, but Maria was determined, and after months of paperwork and background checks, she found herself on a plane to Afghanistan. The SEAL team she cooked for was different from what she expected. They weren't the Hollywood tough guys she had imagined. Sure, they were strong and serious about their missions, but they also joked around, talked about their families, and always thanked her for the meals. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the team leader, made sure everyone treated her with respect. Petty Officer First Class Tony Rodriguez reminded her of her brother Diego, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. The outpost itself was small and isolated. Situated in a valley surrounded by rocky mountains, it housed about 30 people total, including the SEAL team, some Army soldiers, and support staff like Maria. The nearest friendly base was 40 miles away, connected only by a dangerous mountain road that convoys rarely used. As Maria flipped pancakes on the industrial griddle, she could hear the familiar sound of helicopters in the distance. The team was scheduled to go out on a mission today, something about gathering intelligence in a nearby village. She always worried when they left, counting the hours until they returned safely. Tony walked into the mess hall, already dressed in his combat gear. His rifle hung across his chest and his face was painted with camouflage. Despite the serious look, he still managed to smile at Maria. "Smells amazing in here, as always," he said, grabbing a plate. "What's the special today, Chef Santos?" Maria laughed. The guys always called her Chef Santos, even though she was technically just kitchen staff. "Same thing it always is, Tony. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead." "Perfect. Fuel for another fun day in paradise." Tony loaded his plate and sat down at one of the metal tables. Soon the rest of the team joined him. Maria watched them eat. These brave men who put their lives on the line every day. She felt proud to play even a small part in taking care of them. Lieutenant Commander Morrison finished his breakfast and stood up. "All right, gentlemen. Wheels up in 15 minutes. Standard intel gathering mission. We should be back before dinner." He looked at Maria. "Don't suppose you could make that beef stew tonight? The one with the potatoes?" "Already planned on it," Maria replied with a smile. "You boys be careful out there." "Always are," Morrison said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Every mission carried risks in this part of Afghanistan. The team filed out of the mess hall, leaving Maria alone with the dirty dishes and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. She began cleaning up, methodically washing plates and scrubbing pans. Through the small window above the sink, she could see the team boarding their helicopters. 2 Blackhawks lifted off, disappearing over the mountain ridge. Maria spent the rest of the morning preparing for lunch and starting the beef stew for dinner. Around noon, she served sandwiches to the remaining personnel at the outpost. The afternoon dragged on slowly. She prepped vegetables, checked inventory, and tried not to think about the team out there in hostile territory. By evening, Maria had the beef stew simmering and fresh bread cooling on racks. The SEAL team should have been back by now. She kept looking at the radio mounted on the mess hall wall, waiting for word from the command post. At 1900 hours, the radio finally crackled to life. Maria stopped stirring the stew to listen. "Base, this is Watchdog. We have a situation. SEAL team is overdue for check-in. Last known position was Grid 41S MD 12345-67890. No response to radio calls." Maria's heart sank. Overdue for check-in meant something was wrong. She had been around the military long enough to know that teams didn't just go silent unless there was trouble. She turned off the stove burner under the stew and sat down heavily at one of the tables. Through the window, she could see soldiers running between buildings, obviously preparing for something. The easy routine of her day had just been shattered. Hours passed with no word. Maria couldn't bring herself to put away the food. She kept the stew warm, hoping the team would walk through the door hungry and tired but safe. As midnight approached, she finally accepted that they wouldn't be coming back tonight. She lay in her small bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Tony's jokes and Morrison's polite requests for beef stew. Somewhere out there in the darkness, her team was in trouble, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was just the cook after all. The next morning brought bad news. Maria was serving breakfast to a much smaller group when Lieutenant Colonel Davis from the command post entered the mess hall. His face was grim, and Maria knew before he spoke that her fears were confirmed. "Listen up, everyone," Davis announced. "I need to inform you that SEAL Team 7 has been declared missing in action. Their helicopters were found crashed approximately 20 miles northeast of here. There were signs of enemy activity at the crash site." Maria dropped the spatula she was holding. The metal clanged loudly on the floor, but she barely heard it over the ringing in her ears. Missing in action. The words echoed in her mind like a bad dream. "Were there any survivors?" asked Sergeant Williams, one of the Army soldiers. "Unknown at this time," Davis replied. The crash site showed evidence that some personnel may have survived the initial impact and moved away from the wreckage. "We're organizing search and rescue operations, but the area is heavily controlled by Taliban forces." Maria felt sick. She excused herself and rushed outside, breathing heavily in the cool morning air. Tony, Morrison, and the rest of the team could be out there right now, injured, captured, or worse. The thought of them needing help while she stood safely in the kitchen made her feel helpless and angry. Over the next 3 days, Maria tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. She cooked meals for the remaining personnel, but her heart wasn't in it. Every time a helicopter flew overhead, she ran outside hoping to see the familiar faces of her SEAL team. Each time she was disappointed. The search and rescue missions brought back pieces of equipment and some personal items, but no people. The Taliban controlled too much of the area for ground teams to conduct thorough searches. The few aerial reconnaissance flights revealed nothing useful. On the 4th day, everything changed. Maria was in the storage room counting canned goods when she heard shouting from outside. She dropped her clipboard and ran toward the commotion. Soldiers were pointing at the perimeter fence where a figure was stumbling toward the gate. It was Tony Rodriguez. He was barely recognizable, covered in dirt and blood, his uniform torn and his face gaunt from days without proper food or water. But he was alive, and Maria had never been so happy to see anyone in her life. The medics rushed Tony to the small infirmary while Maria hovered nearby, desperate for news about the rest of the team. When the doctor finally let her visit, Tony was cleaned up and connected to an IV, but his eyes were alert and focused. "Maria," he said weakly when he saw her, "I was hoping I'd make it back for dinner." Despite everything, Maria found herself laughing through her tears. "Always thinking about food, aren't you?" Tony's expression grew serious. "The others are alive, but they're in trouble. We were ambushed after the helicopter went down. Morrison, Jackson, Williams, and Thompson are being held prisoner in a compound about 15 miles from here. I managed to escape during a firefight, but they couldn't make it out." Maria felt a mix of relief and terror. Alive, but captured. In some ways, that was worse than not knowing. "The Taliban fighters who have them aren't local," Tony continued. "They're foreign fighters, probably from Pakistan. They're well-armed and well-organized. The good news is they're keeping our guys alive, probably for prisoner exchange or propaganda purposes." Lieutenant Colonel Davis arrived and began debriefing Tony immediately. Maria listened from the corner as Tony described the compound where his teammates were being held. It was a fortified position built into the side of a mountain, with multiple escape routes and heavy weapons positions. Any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous. "We need to get a message to command," Davis said. "Request immediate support for a rescue operation." "Sir," Tony interrupted, "I need to tell you something else." I overheard the guards talking. "They're planning to move our guys tomorrow morning. Once they relocate them to the main Taliban stronghold across the border, we'll never get them back." Davis looked troubled. "That doesn't give us much time. It'll take at least 18 hours to get a proper rescue team here from the nearest base." Maria watched the conversation with growing frustration. These men were talking about time frames and proper procedures while Morrison and the others sat in enemy hands. Every hour of delay meant more torture, more suffering, and less chance of a successful rescue. "What about the personnel we have here?" Maria asked. Everyone turned to look at her, apparently surprised that the cook was joining a tactical discussion. "Ma'am, we have 12 Army soldiers and a few Air Force technicians," Davis explained patiently. "They're good people, but they're not trained for this kind of operation. A hostage rescue requires specialized skills and equipment we simply don't have." Maria felt something burning in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd had when Diego died, the same frustration that had brought her to Afghanistan in the first place. The system was failing the people she cared about, and everyone seemed ready to accept that as inevitable. "So we just wait?" she asked. "We just let them suffer while we follow proper procedures?" Tony reached out and took her hand. "Maria, I know how you feel, but Davis is right. This isn't something that can be done by regular soldiers. These guys have hostages, heavy weapons, and prepared positions. It would be a suicide mission." That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Morrison asking for beef stew, about Tony's jokes, about all the conversations they'd shared over meals in the mess hall. These weren't just soldiers to her anymore. They were her friends, her family, and they needed help that apparently wasn't coming. She got up and walked to the mess hall, needing something to do with her hands. As she started preparing early breakfast, an idea began forming in her mind. It was crazy, dangerous, and probably impossible, but as she thought about her friends sitting in that compound, waiting for rescue that might never come, the idea began to seem less crazy and more like the only option left. Maria spent the morning serving breakfast with a new sense of purpose. While the soldiers ate and discussed their limited options for helping the captured SEAL team, she was quietly observing and planning. She had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago, but Diego's death and months of caring for these warriors had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. After breakfast, she approached Sergeant Williams, a tough Army veteran who had always been friendly to her. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Santos. What's on your mind? If someone hypothetically wanted to learn about weapons and tactical movement, where would they start?" Williams raised an eyebrow. "Hypothetically? That's an odd question coming from the cook. You thinking about switching jobs?" Maria chose her words carefully. "Let's just say I want to be more useful around here than just making meals." "These are dangerous times." Williams studied her face for a moment. "Well, hypothetically, they'd start with basic rifle training, learn how to handle an M4, understand sight picture, breathing, trigger control, then maybe some basic movement techniques, how to use cover and concealment." He paused. "But Maria, cooking is important work. Don't sell yourself short. I appreciate that, Sergeant, but sometimes important work isn't enough." That afternoon, Maria found excuses to walk around the base perimeter. She studied the guard positions, noted the patrol schedules, and observed how the soldiers moved and communicated. What she was planning would require her to slip away unnoticed, and she needed to understand the base security patterns. She also spent time in the armory with Corporal Stevens, the young soldier responsible for maintaining the weapons. Under the pretense of cleaning the mess hall storage area, she engaged him in conversation about the equipment stored there. "That's a lot of firepower," she commented, looking at the rifles racked along the walls. "Yes, ma'am. We've got M4s, some sniper rifles, grenades, night vision equipment, pretty much everything except heavy artillery." Stevens was obviously proud of his work maintaining the weapons. "How do you keep track of it all?" "Daily inventory. Every weapon is checked and accounted for." He showed her the logbook where each item was meticulously recorded. Maria made mental notes while appearing only casually interested. That evening, she volunteered to help with inventory in the supply depot. She learned the locations of medical supplies, ammunition, and other equipment that might be useful. The soldiers were happy to have help with the tedious work of checking and counting supplies. As night fell, Maria made her way to Tony's bedside in the infirmary. He was recovering well, though still weak from his ordeal. "How are you feeling?" she asked, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "Better. The doc says I should be ready for light duty in a few days." Tony looked at her closely. "You seem different today. What's going on in that head of yours?" Maria had debated whether to tell Tony about her plan. He would try to stop her, of course, but she owed him honesty. "Tony, I need you to describe the compound where they're holding the team. I need details about the layout, the guard positions, everything you can remember." "Maria, why do you need to know that? You're not thinking of doing something stupid, are you?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm thinking of doing something that needs to be done. Someone has to help them, and it doesn't look like help is coming through official channels." Tony struggled to sit up straighter. Listen to me very carefully. That place is a fortress. I barely escaped, and I'm trained for this kind of thing. You're a cook, Maria. A brave, tough cook, but still a cook. I was a cook when my brother died too. Didn't stop me from coming here to help. This is different. This is combat. Real deadly combat against experienced fighters who won't hesitate to kill you. Maria was quiet for a moment. Tell me about the compound, Tony. Please. Seeing that she wasn't going to be deterred, Tony sighed heavily and began describing what he remembered. The compound was built into a hillside, with a main building surrounded by smaller structures. There were usually 4 to 6 guards during the day, more at night. The prisoners were being held in a stone building near the center of the complex. The main weakness is the backside, Tony explained reluctantly. It faces away from the valley approach so they don't watch it as carefully. There's a goat path that runs along the ridge above the compound. If someone could get up there without being seen, they could get inside? Maybe, but Maria, even if you somehow got inside, then what? You'd have 4 trained SEALs who are probably injured and definitely weakened. How do you get them out? How do you fight your way through enemy positions while protecting hostages? Maria had been thinking about exactly that problem. What if I didn't have to fight my way out? What if I could create enough confusion and chaos that they could escape on their own? Tony looked at her with growing alarm. You're talking about a diversion. Something big enough to draw the guards away from the prisoners. Would it work? Maybe, but Maria, creating that kind of diversion usually involves explosives or sustained gunfire. Either way, you'd be putting yourself in extreme danger. These aren't movie bad guys. They shoot back and they shoot to kill. Maria stood up and put her hand on Tony's shoulder. Get some rest. You need to recover so you can help coordinate the search when official help arrives. Maria, promise me you won't do anything foolish. These guys wouldn't want you risking your life for them. She smiled sadly. That's exactly why someone needs to risk their life for them. Later that night, Maria returned to the mess hall and sat at the table where the team usually ate breakfast. She could almost see them there, joking and complaining about the food while preparing for another dangerous mission. The empty chairs made her decision feel even more right. She had never fired a weapon in combat or moved tactically through enemy territory, but she had spent 8 months watching professionals do exactly that. She had listened to their stories, observed their techniques, and absorbed their attitudes about courage and sacrifice. More importantly, she had the one thing that official rescue missions often lacked: the desperate motivation of someone trying to save family. Maria opened a notebook and began writing detailed plans for what she was starting to think of as a one-woman rescue operation. It was probably impossible, and she would probably die trying, but sitting safely in the kitchen while her friend suffered was no longer an option she could live with. At 0200 hours, Maria crept through the darkened base toward the armory. She had memorized the guard rotation schedule and knew she had a 15-minute window when Corporal Stevens would be making his rounds on the opposite side of the compound. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the building where the weapons were stored. The lock on the armory door was a simple combination lock that Stevens had opened dozens of times while she was nearby helping with inventory. Maria had good eyes and a good memory. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the dial, but the lock clicked open on her first try. Inside, she moved by feel and memory, not daring to use a flashlight. She selected an M4 rifle, 4 magazines of ammunition, a pistol with a holster, night vision goggles, and a small pack of medical supplies. She also took 2 hand grenades, though she wasn't entirely sure how to use them properly. Finally, she grabbed a radio and a GPS device. Getting out of the armory unseen was easier than getting in. Maria made her way to the motor pool where several vehicles were parked. She had watched the mechanics work on the trucks and had even helped move them around the compound. Starting one without keys would be impossible, but she had observed where the spare keys were kept. The old Toyota pickup truck started with a quiet rumble. Maria had chosen it because it looked like the civilian vehicles common in the area and would be less obviously military if spotted from a distance. She drove slowly toward the main gate, her plan depending on the guard recognizing her as kitchen staff. "Santos, what are you doing out here at this hour?" asked Private Johnson, the young soldier manning the gate. Maria had prepared for this question. "Colonel Davis sent me to pick up some supplies that were dropped off down the road. Apparently there was some mix-up with the delivery schedule." Johnson looked confused but not suspicious. "At 2 in the morning? That seems weird. Tell me about it." But the colonel wants those supplies before morning, so here I am. Maria tried to sound annoyed rather than nervous. Johnson shrugged and opened the gate. Drive safe, Santos. It's pretty dark out there. Thanks, Johnson. See you at breakfast? Maria drove slowly until she was out of sight of the base, then pressed harder on the accelerator. According to Tony's description and the GPS coordinates he had provided, the compound was about 90 minutes away by road, then another hour of hiking through rough terrain. As she drove through the empty landscape, Maria thought about what she was doing. 6 months ago, she had been flipping burgers in San Antonio. Now she was driving alone through Taliban-controlled territory, armed with military weapons she barely knew how to use, planning to assault a fortified position held by experienced fighters. It should have seemed insane, but somehow it felt like the most natural thing in the world. She reached the turnoff point just before dawn. Maria parked the truck behind a cluster of rocks and began the hike toward the compound. The night vision goggles made the rocky terrain appear in shades of green, and she moved as quietly as possible through the scrub brush and boulders. The compound appeared exactly as Tony had described it. A main stone building flanked by smaller structures all built into the side of a hill. Maria counted 5 guards that she could see, though there were probably more inside. Through the night vision goggles, she could make out the building where the prisoners were supposedly being held. She worked her way around to the backside of the compound, using the goat path Tony had mentioned. It was slow going, and twice she had to freeze in place when guards appeared on the walls above. Her hands were scratched and bleeding from climbing over rocks, but she finally reached a position where she could see into the compound from above. The layout was just as Tony had drawn it for her. The prisoner building was about 50 meters from her position, across a courtyard that was partially covered by shadows. Maria checked her watch. Dawn was approaching, which meant the guards would probably change shifts soon. Her plan was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. She would use the grenades to create explosions on the far side of the compound, drawing the guards away from the prisoner building. In the confusion, she would try to reach Morrison and the others and help them escape through the back route she had just climbed. The weakness in the plan was obvious to anyone with military training. Once she threw the grenades, every fighter in the compound would know someone was attacking. They would search for her while simultaneously increasing security around the prisoners. If she didn't reach the prison building quickly, the plan would fail and her friends would probably be killed in retaliation. But Maria had advantages that a traditional rescue team wouldn't have. She was alone, so she could move quickly without coordinating with others. She was unexpected, since no one would anticipate a lone kitchen worker attempting a rescue. Most importantly, she was desperate enough to try things that trained soldiers would correctly identify as suicidal. As the sky began to lighten in the east, Maria saw the guard shift change she had been waiting for. 2 guards left their positions and walked toward the main building, probably for breakfast or rest. This was her moment. She pulled the pin on her first grenade and threw it as hard as she could toward the far corner of the compound. The explosion was louder than she had expected, and immediately shouts erupted from the buildings below. Guards came running from all directions toward the source of the blast. Maria threw the second grenade toward a different part of the compound, creating more confusion and noise. Then she slung her rifle across her back and began climbing down the rocky slope toward the prisoner building. Her heart was beating so loudly she was sure the remaining guards could hear it. She reached the wall of the prison building just as automatic gunfire erupted from various positions around the compound. The guards were shooting at shadows, not sure where the attack was coming from. Maria found a small window set high in the stone wall and called softly through it. "Morrison, can you hear me?" A familiar voice responded immediately. "Maria, what the hell are you doing here?" "Getting you out. Are you all okay? Can you move?" "We're banged up but mobile. Jackson has a broken arm, but we can travel. How many people are with you?" Maria took a deep breath. "Just me." There was silence from inside the building, then Morrison's voice again, very controlled. "Maria, listen to me carefully. You need to get out of here right now. This is not something you can handle alone." "Too late for that, Lieutenant Commander. I'm already here and I'm not leaving without you." More gunfire erupted from the compound, and Maria could hear guards shouting orders in a language she didn't understand. Whatever confusion her grenades had created was starting to fade as the fighters regained control of the situation. Maria examined the door to the prison building and found it secured with a heavy padlock. She had brought bolt cutters from the base tool shop, And though the lock was thick, desperation gave her strength. The metal parted with a sharp snap that sounded impossibly loud in the morning air. "Stand back from the door," she called softly through the window. Morrison, Jackson, Williams, and Thompson were exactly where Tony had said they would be, sitting against the far wall of a small stone room. They looked tired and beaten, but their eyes were alert and focused. Jackson's left arm was clearly broken and hung at an odd angle in a makeshift sling. "Santos, you beautiful crazy woman," Williams said with a grin. "How did you get here?" "Long story. We need to move now." Maria handed Morrison her pistol and gave Williams the extra magazines for the rifle. Tony described a path up the back ridge that leads away from here. "Can everyone make that climb?" Morrison checked his team quickly. "Jackson's going to need help, but we can manage it." "What's the tactical situation out there?" "Honestly, I have no idea. I threw some grenades to create a distraction, but I think they're starting to figure out where the attack came from." As if to prove her point, gunfire erupted much closer to their position. "They're doing a systematic sweep," Thompson said, listening to the pattern of shooting. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they check this building." Morrison took charge immediately. "Williams, take point. Santos, stay behind Jackson and help him if he needs it. Thompson, you've got rear guard. We move fast and quiet until we reach cover. Then we reassess." They slipped out of the building and began working their way toward the back wall of the compound. The rocky terrain that had made Maria's approach so difficult would now provide cover for their escape. But first they had to cross 30 meters of open ground. Williams reached the base of the slope and signaled for the others to follow. Jackson was moving well despite his injury, and Maria found herself impressed by the toughness of these men even when wounded and exhausted. They had just reached the cover of the rocks when shouts erupted behind them. "They found the empty cell," Morrison said grimly. "Now this becomes a running fight." The next hour was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. They climbed and scrambled over rocks while gunfire echoed behind them. Sometimes the shots seemed close enough that Maria could hear bullets striking stone nearby. Other times the enemy seemed to lose their trail and the shooting faded into the distance. Jackson was struggling with the climb, and Maria found herself half carrying him over the more difficult sections. Williams and Morrison moved like ghosts, somehow finding paths through the rocks that provided cover while still allowing for speed. Thompson brought up the rear, occasionally stopping to watch for pursuit. "There's a plateau about half a mile ahead," Morrison told them during a brief rest. "If we can reach that, we'll have better visibility and can see any pursuit coming." But as they approached the plateau, Thompson called out a warning. "Movement behind us. At least 6 fighters, maybe more. They're gaining ground." Morrison studied the terrain ahead. "The plateau is too exposed. If they catch us there, we'll be pinned down with no cover." He looked at Maria. "How much ammunition do you have?" Maria checked her magazines. "Maybe 60 rounds for the rifle, and I gave you the pistol." "That's not enough for a sustained firefight." Morrison was thinking rapidly. "We need another diversion, something to break contact and give us time to reach better defensive positions." "I could double back and slow them down," Thompson volunteered. "Negative. We stick together." Morrison looked around at the rocky landscape. "There's got to be another way." Maria had an idea, but it was the kind of idea that made her stomach clench with fear. "What if I drew them off? If I went a different direction and made noise, they might follow me instead of you." "Absolutely not," Morrison said immediately. "We're not splitting up, and we're certainly not using you as bait. With respect, sir, I didn't come this far to play it safe now." Maria checked her rifle and made sure she knew how to switch the safety off. "You guys are injured and exhausted. I'm fresh and I know the way back to the truck." Williams shook his head. "Santos, that's a suicide mission. These guys are professionals and I'm what? Just a cook?" Maria felt anger flaring up. "I got this far, didn't I? I got you out of that prison while your professional rescue teams were still filling out paperwork." Morrison held up his hand for silence. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. "Everyone quiet while I think." The gunfire behind them was now close enough that they could hear voices calling out in what sounded like coordinated search patterns. Maria counted at least 3 different positions, which meant the enemy had split into teams to cover more ground. "They're setting up a net," Thompson said quietly. "Pretty soon they'll have us surrounded." Maria made her decision. Before anyone could stop her, she stood up and began climbing toward a rocky outcrop that would give her a clear view of their pursuers. "Hey!" she shouted at the top of her lungs. "You want the Americans? Come and get them." She opened fire with her rifle, not really aiming at anything but making as much noise as possible. The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, all directed toward her location. Bullets sparked off the rocks around her as she dove for cover. "Santos, get back here," Morrison shouted, but Maria was already moving. She fired another burst toward the enemy positions, then began working her way along the ridge in the opposite direction from where the SEAL team was hiding. The enemy fighters took the bait, redirecting their advance toward her position. For the next 20 minutes, Maria played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks. She would fire a few shots from one position, then move to another location before return fire could pin her down. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Every time bullets cracked past her head, she thought about Diego and Morrison and all the people she was trying to protect. The enemy fighters were good, but they were also cautious. They had lost track of 5 prisoners and were now dealing with what seemed like a new threat. They moved carefully, which gave Maria time to stay ahead of them. Finally, she heard Morrison's voice on the radio she had taken from the base. "Santos, this is Morrison. We've reached good defensive positions and have visual on the extraction point. You've done enough. Time to get out of there." Maria looked around at the rocky maze where she had been hiding and fighting. She had somehow managed to draw the entire enemy force away from the SEAL team. But now she was trapped in hostile territory with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. "Copy that, Morrison. I'll meet you at the vehicle." She tried to sound confident, but the truth was she had no idea how to get back to the truck without running into the fighters who were still hunting for her. Getting back to the truck turned out to be the most difficult part of Maria's entire rescue mission. The enemy fighters had spread out across the mountainside, and several times she had to hide motionless among the rocks while armed men passed within a few feet of her position. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, but she forced herself to move slowly and carefully. The morning sun was climbing higher, which made concealment more difficult but also provided better visibility. Maria could see the fighters, moving in coordinated teams, obviously experienced in this kind of search operation. She began to understand just how lucky she had been during the initial assault on the compound. It took her 2 hours to work her way back to where she had left the truck. When she finally saw the vehicle, her heart sank. 3 enemy fighters were standing around it, apparently trying to decide what to do about this unexpected discovery. One of them was speaking rapidly into a radio, probably calling for instructions. Maria crouched behind a boulder about 100 meters away and tried to think. She was down to her last magazine of ammunition, exhausted from hours of climbing and fighting, and trapped between the truck and the fighters who were still searching for her in the rocks behind her. Even if she could somehow deal with the 3 men at the truck, the sound of gunfire would bring the others running. That's when she heard the familiar sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. At first, she thought it might be enemy aircraft, but as the sound grew louder, she recognized the distinctive pitch of American Blackhawks. Someone at the base must have finally organized a proper search and rescue mission. The fighters around the truck heard the helicopters too, and immediately began moving toward defensive positions in the rocks. This was exactly the distraction Maria needed. She waited until all 3 men had taken cover, then sprinted toward the truck as fast as her tired legs could carry her. She reached the vehicle just as the helicopters came into view over the ridge. The key was still where she had left it, and the engine started immediately. Maria put the truck in gear and drove away from the landing zone, hoping to link up with the SEAL team at the coordinates Morrison had given her. The extraction point was a flat area about 2 miles from the compound, accessible by vehicle and suitable for helicopter landing. When Maria arrived, she found Morrison and his team waiting in defensive positions among some large rocks. They looked surprised but relieved to see her. "Santos, how did you get past those fighters?" Williams called out as she parked the truck. "Helicopters showed up and distracted them," Maria replied, climbing out of the vehicle on unsteady legs. "I think our ride home is here." The Blackhawks landed in a cloud of dust and noise. Maria watched as medics rushed to check on Jackson, and the other team members, while heavily armed soldiers established a security perimeter. It was over. They were safe. Lieutenant Commander Morrison walked over to where Maria was sitting on the truck's tailgate. His face was serious, but there was something else in his expression that she couldn't quite identify. "Maria Santos, He said formally, "What you did today was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen. Maybe both." Maria managed a tired smile. "Did it work?" "It worked. You saved 4 lives today, probably at great risk to your own." Morrison sat down beside her on the tailgate. "But I have to ask, what made you think you could pull off something like this? You're not trained for combat operations." Maria thought about the question while watching the soldiers load Jackson onto a stretcher. "I guess I learned more than I thought just from watching you guys and listening to your stories. But mostly, I just couldn't stand the idea of sitting safely in the kitchen while you were in danger." "That's not really an answer. Maybe not, but it's the only one I have." Maria looked at Morrison directly. "You asked me once what it was like, being the only woman at the outpost. I told you it was fine, that everyone treated me with respect. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Morrison waited for her to continue. "The whole truth is that I felt like an outsider sometimes. Like I was just supporting the mission instead of really being part of it. When you guys were captured, I finally had a chance to actually do something important instead of just watching from the sidelines. Cooking is important, Maria. We couldn't do our jobs without people like you taking care of the basics." "I know that. But sometimes important isn't enough." Maria stood up as one of the medics approached to check her for injuries. "Sometimes, you have to do something impossible just to prove to yourself that you can." The flight back to base was surreal after the intensity of the morning's events. Maria found herself sitting next to Tony, who had insisted on being part of the rescue mission despite his own recent injuries. He kept shaking his head and grinning at her. "Maria Santos, one-woman army," he said. "This is going to be one hell of a story back home." "I just did what needed doing," Maria replied. But even as she said it, she knew that something fundamental had changed inside her. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed and had proven something to herself about courage and determination. Back at the base, Maria found herself the center of unexpected attention. Word of her rescue mission had spread quickly, and soldiers kept stopping by the mess hall to congratulate her. Lieutenant Colonel Davis called her into his office for a formal debriefing, and she learned that her unauthorized departure had triggered the official search and rescue operation. "You realize, of course, that what you did was completely against regulations," Davis told her. "Taking weapons without authorization, leaving the base without permission, conducting unauthorized combat operations. I could have you court-martialed for any one of those things." Maria nodded. "Yes, sir, I understand." Davis studied her for a moment. "However, the results speak for themselves. 4 American servicemen are alive today because of your actions. That counts for something." A week later, Maria was back in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the team. Morrison had been cleared for light duty, Jackson was recovering from surgery on his arm, and the others were gradually getting back to normal routines. But the atmosphere in the mess hall was different now. The easy camaraderie was still there, but it was seasoned with a new kind of respect. "Hey, Santos," Tony called out while loading his plate with eggs and bacon. "When you get tired of cooking, you've got a standing offer to join our team. We could use someone with your particular skills." Maria laughed while flipping pancakes on the griddle. "Thanks, but I think I'll stick to cooking. Someone has to keep you guys fed properly." But as she said it, she knew that she would never again think of herself as just the cook. She had learned something important about herself in those rocky mountains, something about the difference between supporting a mission and being part of one. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with the confidence of someone who had stared down armed enemies and emerged victorious. The smell of breakfast filled the mess hall, just like it had every morning for months. But everything was different now because Maria Santos had discovered that heroes come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who never planned to be warriors at all.